Welcome. In this video series, we're going to deploy DNA Center and SDA. I guess I should reference DNA Center as Catalyst Center, as now it's been renamed. Cisco recently released a version that allows us now to run DNA Center or Catalyst Center on VMware, so that's what we'll be using here. I'm not sure how that's going to go in the long term with all the changes happening around VMware with Broadcom, but I guess I digress there. The virtual version is also built to be able to be deployed on cloud in other areas, so I guess all's not lost there. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know that I focus a lot on the from scratch methodology. So much of the training provided always gives you a pre-built solution that you can go play with or walk through specific labs. And I feel like that leaves a lot of the foundation of the product left out. So I focus on building everything from scratch, completely unconfigured, through different scenarios and talk through different solutions and architectures. As an engineer, I've deployed this over and over again. I build it, I break it, I fix it, I wipe it all, I start over, and I do it again. So I can make it work. Am I an expert? Do I claim to be? No. There are so many parts and pieces to SDA, buttons that I've never clicked, don't specifically know what they do or why they're there, that sort of stuff. But am I doing it right? Well, I think so. It works when I'm finished and it's functional. So let's take a look at our setup here. So we'll be working in what I refer to here as Lab 2, and we'll notice that it consists of three 3850 series switches. Now, the 3850s are a little limited in their functionality as it relates to SDA, and while I won't go into full detail on, what the differences are between them and a 9300 or 94, 95, 9600 series switches, they don't run 17x code. They're stuck on the 16.x code train. They can't do Fabric in a box. They can't be used for all three border, control, and edge together, but they can do border control on one and edge on another to actually make a full fabric. So this is what we'll do here. I think additionally there might be some limitations to what application visibility telemetry data we get off of them too, but that won't prevent us from doing anything here in the lab. So if you're watching this and you've got some 9300s laying around that you decide you don't want, you feel free to send them my way. So the lab here is cabled in such a way that I can pretty much use it for anything, right? We're focused on DNAC SDA today, but you'll see as I zoom in here, we've got two links and essentially a full mesh between all of these switches. And we obviously won't be using all of these links. And at the end of the day, I'm just going to shut down what we don't need to use. For our lab, we're simply going to do a border control plane node on Lab 01 or Lab 2 385001, and 02 and 03 will be edge nodes that simply hang off of the border control plane node that is 01. So I'll end up shutting down all of the links from 02 and 03 up to the fusion, and I'll shut down the links between 02 and 03, and what we'll be left with is just 03 having its two links to the border, and 02 also having its two links to the border. Again, this is lab, obviously not ideal, right? In a production environment, we'd want at least two switches up here in the border control plane area to provide us some redundancy. That being said, because SDA is all layer 3 in the underlay, we will be simulating that redundancy here. These two links off of both of these switches will form adjacency with the border switch So, albeit one piece of hardware, it will at least give us some sort of idea of what the redundancy would look like there. Up in the virtual infrastructure area here, we have a number of different virtual machines. Obviously, DNAC, we've got an ISE box, we've got a Windows domain controller, and a 9800 CL wireless controller. Now, on the topic of DNAC, I guess first and foremost, if you've worked with VMware at all, when you look at what the requirements are to run DNAC in a VMware environment, your likely response is going to be that has no business being a VM, and I don't disagree. Our requirements here are 256 gig of RAM reserved and 32 vCPUs with a reservation as well. So a lot of horsepower dedicated to it, and in my environment, even at rest, it's typically well north of 100 gig of RAM that it uses sitting there. So it's a monster and takes quite a bit of horsepower. Regarding the wireless controller, obviously with SDA, there's a number of different ways to handle the wireless controller. If these were 9300s down here, right, we could do Fabric in a box or the embedded wireless controller, depending on the size and type of our site. Being that they're not, and I can't, we've got this wireless controller here. I guess the thing to keep in mind there are the requirements around Fabric-based wireless. It's no longer that 300 millisecond round trip time between the access points and the controller as a requirement. It's much lower than that now when we do Fabric-based wireless. So to wrap this up and recap, again, this is all from scratch. So we'll be deploying DNAC. The VM is deployed, but it's never been powered on. We have to go through the full config there. ISE is deployed, minimally configured and patched. Just an IP address, that's really all it is. The domain controller is built with an Active Directory domain and DHCP services installed. And then the wireless controller is just a fresh OVA deployment. There's no config there. We'll be doing that all from scratch as well. And then the switches down below here, all factory defaulted. They're wiped. They're going to come up empty, and we're going to configure them from scratch as well. They're running 1794A, or excuse me, no, 1612 something. I'm getting them confused with the 9300s here. And we'll be setting up an SDA Fabric where 01 will be our border control plane, 02 and 03 will be edge nodes. And I'll talk a little bit about it as we go through the process here, but I'm going to be onboarding all of this to DNAC manually. There's a lot of different ways to do onboarding with DNAC in a true production environment. If you have more than 2 access layer switches or whatever, you're likely not going to want to manually add every one of those to DNAC. You would end up using either the LAN automation piece or PNP to accomplish that for you. But I feel for, again, kind of the from scratch methodology to truly understand what goes on specifically in the underlay of these devices, it makes sense to manually configure them and not let LAN automation or a plug and play script handle that for this lab. So the first thing we're going to do here is get DNAC up and running. And that's going to take some time. I'll pause the video so we're not just sitting here watching the paint dry, but I will jump into my virtual center here. And we will see that on this .8 host, we have this DNAC V Lab 2 sitting here waiting for us to deploy. So when I power this on, and we launch the web console, it will boot. and should launch into a configuration wizard here. And there we are. So what we'll see here is an initial step 0 screen that does nothing more than lets us put in an IP address for DNAC. This will be the IP address assigned to this node itself. Keep in mind in production we have multiple nodes in a DNAC cluster. This will be specific to the node. Later on we will assign an enterprise VIP or a virtual IP that would be for the whole cluster. Even though we only have one node, that obviously is still required. So if I go back to my lab diagram here, we can see I've got assigned 10.199.0.20 is the VIP and 21 is the server. So here we will head over to configure 10.199.0.21. We don't need any static routes. We'll hit configure, and that will do nothing more than assign it to the box. So here we get two options. We can either continue through this GUI-based installation here, or you'll notice there's a web installation option. We're going to go with the web installation option here. So I will pull up that address, 21.9,004. And you can see we get this web interface to continue through the configuration. Click Start. Now here we can either do a install or advanced install. The advanced install gives us a whole slew of options that the regular install doesn't. However, I found that this regular install is much quicker in the environment to deploy. So I'm going to choose that for now. And here, this shows us our enterprise network interface with the IP address that we had previously assigned. Again, if we would have gone through that other install, we would have had some options to change some of this stuff. I don't need to for the lab. On the next page, we get the options to set our DNS servers, which for me, what is our domain controller? 23. I'm only going to use one. Again, in a production environment, you'd obviously want to have more than one. We don't need a proxy server. And here's where we will get the VIP. So 10.199.0.20. I'm not going to touch the intra-controller VIP. Our domain name, this is lab2.local. That is the Active Directory domain name that DNS server lives on. NTP servers, us.pool. I'll just use some public ones. And again, normally you would want to be internal with your NTP servers, likely too. Next, we set our password for the CLI. This on DNAC will be the magliv user. And next, gives us a reconfiguration here, and this will go ahead and get started. At this point, this continues on. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video because this does take, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes to get finished here. Okay, that finished here in the last minute or two. I'm not really sure how long that took. You'd have to look at the the time in the bottom corner here just to see how long that took. But what you'll notice here is when we're done, it gives us the username and password, initial username, admin, and password for the login. But what you'll find out is that it takes some time in order to boot up. So here, when I click on it, it's just going to sit and spin. Eventually it'll come up with an error, and then finally, after some time, it will show up with the login page. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video again until this comes up, and we'll continue on from there. So after a bit of time, this is up. And the very first thing it's going to do is ask us to log in with the credentials that we were given here. If I could get this to copy properly. And it's going to ask us to create a user. I'm just going to call the user DNAC. Kicks us out, wants us to log in with our new user. It's going to ask us for our Cisco.com ID. I'm going to go ahead and skip this for now. Terms and conditions. Quick start overview. This will let you do a discovery, which I'm not going to do. That's what this is here, so we'll exit out of there. And then the very first thing I will typically do is go over here to the software management and install all of these applications. Now granted, I don't need them all, but I select all, hit install. I actually already did it in the background on accident while it wasn't recording, but you'll see here it'll run, it'll start to install. This one's sitting at 1%. It takes longer to do this than it does to deploy the appliance altogether. So I'm going to pause here and wait for that all to finish. So we're back here. It's actually the next day, so I didn't get back to this yesterday to continue recording, but you'll notice here, obviously, the date has changed, and we can tell here that everything has installed and our DNAC is up and ready to go. So a few things that I'll typically walk through up front. If this were a production environment underneath the system and settings, we have a whole bunch of options here. Connecting it to your smart account, obviously for licensing, smart licensing, Cisco.com credentials, so on and so forth. And the big one that I'm after down here is going to be the authentication and policy servers. So this is where we are going to connect DNAC to ISE. However, depending on what all you want to use DNAC for, there are going to be some things that you need to do on ISE to make it work. So underneath these advanced settings here, right, if I want radius and TACAX both, I'm going to need to choose those. And in addition, if I'm going to connect to PXGrid, I've obviously got to let ISE know that it should accept the connection from DNAC to PXGrid. So if I pull up ISE, was it 22? Yes. Again, this is a fresh install of ISE. There has been no configuration done yet. I patched it and I left it alone. If I go to administration and PXGrid settings here, don't know why that's not coming up. Oh, I know why it's not coming up. I haven't enabled it. Administration and deployment. So underneath our node here, we obviously haven't even turned on PXGrid, thus it's not going to let me configure it yet. I'm going to go ahead and enable device admin as well, passive identity. What the heck, let's just enable it all. It's a lab. Whoops, of course it's not. Once that saves, now we should be able to get to these settings. So here, again, because it's a lab, you probably wouldn't want to do this in a production environment. I'm just going to choose it to allow to automatically approve the certificate-based accounts, which of course, when DNAC reaches out, it'll just auto-accept that request rather than, worrying about it. So, and having to manually approve it or anything. Okay, now that that's done, we should be able to jump back over to DNAC and pull in ISE here. So if I add ISE, in our advanced settings, radius and TAC axis, connect to PX grid. When I connect here, we're going to get an initial connection warning. So this is the first time we've seen this certificate from ISE. It's not yet trusted. Do we want to trust it? Again, this is lab, so my ISE instance is using all pre-built internal self-generated certificates across everything, right? My default self-assign, my PX grid, they're all locally generated certs. So of course, DNAC isn't going to trust that. So if we accept that, it should go through the rest of the connection process here. And we failed to connect to PX grid. So it says we have to fix that first and delete it. So here, I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and let's go figure out what's going on over here. When I initially built this ISE, I used another lab domain name. So you'll notice when I changed it, this one fixed itself up. This one did not. So we are going to need to regenerate the PX grid cert so that it matches. And I think I can just do generate self-signed cert, PX grid. Sure. And now you'll notice our PX grid has the right name. I'll go delete this guy just so I don't get confused about it later. And let's try that all over again. Check my TAC axis. Accept the cert again. Hopefully this works. There we have it. All right, so now our ISE is active and functional here. I think that should be all I need to do in here for now to continue forward. But the next thing we need to worry about is our network hierarchy. So This whole hierarchy is something obviously in your deployment you'll want to pay close attention to. It's going to be, different for every company based on where you operate and where your locations are. I am going to just do a full top down as a world map is. So North America. Oops. Once that's created, we will go to United States. If you had a global company, well, at the end of the day, you could set this up as though, you were going to move into a global company and do it this way. Area, I'm going to say Iowa. It's the state that I'm from. And then here we are going to add a city, which I am going to do Dyersville. And then here we're going to do a building. So we basically went top down, right? Continent, country, state, city. And then within that city, we're going to create a building for the Field of Dreams. Famous movie and baseball history plot here. Within that building, I'm going to add a floor. We'll call it the field. Have a little fun with this here. Here is where I would add a map if I wanted to. And in fact, just for fun, let's go do that. I'm going to pause the video and go take a screenshot of it. All right, we've got the map. So here, if I upload file, and according to my Google measurements, this is roughly 700 feet. And there we can see it. Now, this is the original, not the new stadium they built for the MLB games that have been played there. But again, if we go back and stop, go back to serious here, really this would be a building in your campus or on site. You may, if it's a true campus, right, in the city, you may have the name of the campus, then the buildings in the campus. Nonetheless, it'll come down to your floors. And when you build your floors, obviously, those are just going to be the floor plans of your floors, probably not a large outdoor area. And eventually down the road here, once we get things going, we'll be able to put our access points on the map and their relative locations and stuff like that. So, but for here, we've got this built. And we have a hierarchy. The next thing under network settings, now that we have added ISE, we can start to add some of our global network settings. Again, keep in mind all of these network settings are based on your hierarchy. So as I moved over, it left me on this field down here, and it told me right away, hey, all these settings are currently, being inherited. If I want to assign specifics to a site or a location, obviously I can come in and override them, right? If I have different DHCP servers for a site or domain name servers, whatever, I can assign them based on my hierarchy. Now, I'm going to go back to global because, of course, in my environment, everything's going to get the same thing. So we'll add our network AAA servers. This is going to be my TACACS, right? How I authenticate to the switches, routers, whatever, wireless controllers, the devices that I add. I'm choosing ISE, TACACS, primary admin node, which is also my PSN in ISE. For my client endpoint, this is going to be Radius, but again, my ISE servers, same servers. Obviously, in a true production employment or deployment, you're going to probably have multiples of these, but Here, my DHCP server is going to be my Windows domain controller, which I believe is 10.199.0.23. And yet again, you would probably have multiples in a production environment. Set my domain name, which again for me, lab2.local, that's my Active Directory domain, and the DNS server, again, you would probably have multiples of these, but this is my domain controller. Nothing for image distribution. Here I've noticed for NTP servers, it will not let you put in a URL, or not a URL, but a fully qualified domain name. It wants an IP address, and these NTP servers are what it's going to push to the switches, routers, wireless controllers, all the devices that you add when you provision. So kind of following the same thing I've done everywhere else. In this case, you would normally use internal servers in a production environment, but I'm just using public servers for now. So I'm going to grab a couple of the pool, uspool.ntp.org servers to populate here. My time zone happens to be Central, Chicago. And again, obviously, this is one of those that your hierarchy would matter. I'm setting it as a global. Obviously, I would maybe need to override this if I was a true global company, but we'll save that. There we go. Device credentials. These are going to be the credentials that DNAC has stored to try to log into the devices when I add the devices. So manage credentials. I'm going to add a CLI. I'm using DNAC. We'll see when I configure the switches here later that I do create this user locally. In my environment, this user will also exist in Active Directory. So when we push this config to the devices and it tells them to start using TACACS in ISE, ISE is going to look to Active Directory for this user as well. If you use this user as your default user and then that user is configured locally and DNAC pushes the TACACS config and this user is no longer valid, of course, it's going to break. You're going to have to go into the device. You're going to have to update the user to use a proper TACACS credential, but in my case, I've simply made them both match. Same user, same password, so no matter what happens, whether it's authenticating locally or to TACACS, it's going to work. I feel like I fat-fingered that. Well, evidently not. But I don't trust myself. So here, if I edit this, my super secret password, there we go. And the next one I'm going to add is SNMPv3. Obviously, you don't have to do that, but because this is a lab, we're super secure. SHA AES256. And again, my super secret password. Sign to global. And that was successful. So now here we can see we've got our CLI and we've got our SNMP credentials saved. And we'll use those later when we try to onboard the switches. IP address pools. These are going to be pools that we can reserve blocks of for SDA. So I'm going to go ahead and create a global pool, and then we're going to go down to our Field of Dreams site and we are going to reserve some address space. When I look back over at my chart here, again, this is just something I assigned. Depending on the size of your SDA site, etc., you can come up with a proper IP scheme for the sites and stuff. For here, I just grabbed a WAC 14, 204 through 207 from for my global SuperNet for SDA. So here, if I come back, again, I'm creating this pool at the root. I will reserve it, pieces of it, somewhere down in the rest of the environment. So when I add, pool name is going to be, we'll call it Lab 2, IP subnet, WAC 14 here. I don't need a gateway, DHCP, or DNS on this. It's a global pool, so I'm going to save. What we will notice, though, based on the configurations I made earlier on the servers page, the drop downs are there for my pre-configured servers. So I'm going to save. Then we'll go back down here to my Field of Dreams site. And at this point, I'm going to say reserve. Again, I'm not on the floor itself in this case. I'm on the building. And we are going to create a number of reserved IP pools. So first, a pool for my Fusion transit. Here, notice I'm going to pick from my global pool. Prefix length, I'm making everything WAC 24s. Clearly, most of this isn't going to need that, but 0, 0, 10, 2, well, actually, I don't need a gateway or DHCP or DNS. This Fusion pool, when I create my Fusion transit, which will be that BGP connectivity between my border node and the Fusion, is what it's going to grab addresses for. I don't have to do this. I can manually configure that. I will show you that when we build it, but I'm going to create the pool regardless. So I will reserve that. Oh, it is going to make me choose a gateway. No, it didn't. Perfect. So now we can see we have this reservation here. We're going to go ahead and add some additionals. Data. This will be effectively used for data clients on the LAN, plugged in physical clients. I'm going to make it a WAC 24, 10.204 1.0, DHCP servers, DNS servers. Now, when I create an Anycast gateway in my fabric, it's going to use this data, right? So my IP helper address is going to get set based on the DHCP server here. My gateway, which I fat fingered, is going to be .1. So when it builds the Anycast gateway for this network for my wired data clients, it's going to build an SVI. I'm going to assign it a VLAN, and at that point, it will create the SVI using this IP address because it is the gateway and an IP helper for these DHCP servers. So we'll reserve that. Let's do a few more. We'll call this voice. Ten 204 2.0, 204 2.1. Again, select our specifics. Call this one corporate wireless. Wireless APs. And because this is infrastructure related here, I just threw it up at 254. Again, I didn't spend a whole lot of time. Obviously, in a production network, you would want to kind of, create some sort of standards here where maybe, data at every site was a .1 and, wireless APs at every site were 254, whatever it might be. Here, again, lab, I'm just throwing stuff in. I think that is what we will need to get through the initial build here. From a wireless perspective, because we are going to have wireless in the end here, we'll go ahead and create a SID. And notice how it left me down here, and I'm looking around. There's no way to create a SID. They got to be created global. We'll call it Enterprise. We'll just call it Corp as the SID name. All of our typical wireless settings here. What frequencies are we advertising it on? What quality of service do we advertise it on? Here, Enterprise, I'm going to say WPA2. And we will configure our AAA servers. This will be a .1x based SID. And we're going to point our AAA obviously at ISE, which of course is already there for us. .1x. We'll leave everything here defaults. This is all wireless specific stuff. Add a profile. Now I'm naming this profile for the site. Again, this gets into, right, this profile is going to be assigned to sites. So if this is kind of a default or a global that is going to broadcast whatever SIDs you build to multiple sites, this would be a bad name in that scenario. But here I'm going to say that this is going to be Fabric. I'm going to associate it. Next. Save. Now if I go to configure network profile, I can assign this to my site or multiple sites, and that is what is going to tie that SID that I built and assign to the profile to a site to make sure that it gets deployed there. And of course I checked that it was going to be Fabric. If we edit this, I kind of breezed through that, but I made this a Fabric based wireless. So then if we go back to our network settings, telemetry here, again, got to be careful. It'll sneak you around, but by default, we send everything to DNA Center. I'm going to enable the wired collection to send that to DNA Center as well. And I believe that is everything we are going to need here. Now, the next thing I'm going to need is to start building my SDA Fabric. And I guess what you notice here is we're going to run out of runway, so to speak, with what we can do here in DNAC as far as configuring our actual fabric right there. We're going to need switches added before we can go too far, but there are some things we can do up front that aren't going to require any switches. So if we look at our fabric sites, here we'll notice we don't have one. So we can create a fabric site. And here again, through our hierarchy, we're going to tie it to the Field of Dreams, which of course is going to, be everything underneath that in our floors. Next. We're going to call it closed authentication. This, of course, is the wired switch port auth, how we're going to handle devices that are plugged in. In my case, I'm starting off closed. We will configure or have to configure ISE, right, to handle letting the access point and any other wired devices authenticate properly with policy, return VLANs, etc., just so that, you know, whether it be MAB or .1x, that they get connected to the network properly. I'm not going to do any fabric zones. This is a concept that, you know, I mentioned earlier in the video that I don't know everything about this. These fabric zones, I'm not 100% sure about, you know, how they operate, what they're specifically for. So that would be something that would come later. We go through all of the screens here, and it will calculate. And notice it says there were no devices found, which we would expect. We don't have any yet. So we'll just submit this. It will create it. And at this point, we have our Fabric site built. Now, from a virtual networks perspective, in the SDA, VNs essentially equal VRFs. The infra VN is always the default VRF. So there is one thing that we have to put in the infra VN. The default VN is created for the wireless, or excuse me, is created with DNAC by default. You may choose or not choose to use that. In my case, right now, I'm only going to use the infra VN. I'll do manage all. Click on this guy, and I'm going to associate this to my Fabric site that I just built. And we go through this process again. And again, no devices to apply anything to, so, and no Fabric built anyway. But now we've assigned this, we can see it's associated to our Fabric site. Now that this is associated to our Fabric site, we can go in and create some Anycast gateways. So when I hit create here, we're going to assign it to the infra VN, which of course is our default VRF on the switch. And now we can choose our pools. These are obviously what we created earlier and reserved for the site. We will start with our wireless APs. VLAN name, we'll call it APs. VLAN ID 254. You can let DNAC auto configure the name. It comes up with something like this, but I'm going to give them specific names. Notice here it chooses Fabric APs as the pool type. And we go through the same process again here. And we'll save that. So the one thing that we'll notice with this Anycast gateway, if I go back in and I edit it, it is in the infra VN, and that is where our Fabric-based access points have to live. We have to build this pool and have a place to put our access points in the infra VN. If I cancel out of here and we go to start to add other Anycast gateways to this infra VN, what we're going to notice is that we don't get the ability to do anything other than Fabric APs or extended nodes. So all of our other networks have to go into a different VN. And that's why they create that default VN for you if you want to use it. In my case, I'm just going to go ahead and create a new one. There's really not much to this, right? I'm going to call it Field of Dreams. Next, we're going to assign it to our site. Save it. And now when we come back to our Anycast gateways and we go to create one, we can choose our Field of Dreams VN. And now we get some different options. So here, my corporate wireless pool, I'll call it Corp SID. It's going to be VLAN 3. Let it be QoS voice. And this is Fabric enabled wireless. So that's the only time in our deployment here that we'll check that, but that makes this pool available to be assigned to the wireless SID when we get that far. So that deployed that SID or wireless Anycast gateway for the wireless network. Now we just have to go through and create the rest of them. So kind of the same exact process. The only difference here is we will be doing our data, and I will call this data. And one thing you'll notice, I was trying to be smart here, right? I did .1, which of course would reside to VLAN 1, and I can't use VLAN 1. So I could go back and fix this, remove this pool, add a new one. I'm just going to move this to 10. But a note, I guess, happy little accident, you obviously can't use VLAN 1 here. I don't need, obviously, any of the Fabric-enabled wireless because this is for a wired network. And we will finish this. Save the intent. And then back to here, create another one. Same thing. Those out of my way. Voice. Did let me do 2. We'll choose voice here. And notice I could have done this earlier. I can do an add here and add another one. Now the only one we've got left is our Fusion Transit. We're not going to use that here. We don't need to create an Anycast gateway for that. So this will be the last network we create here. Save that guy. And now we've got that all created. So the next thing we'll do, now that we've got our VN and our gateways created, is our transit. So here we're going to create a transit. I'll call it Fusion Transit. And in our case, this is IP-based. This is going to be the exit of our fabric. This ASN is going to be the ASN that's going to reside on the Fusion router. So it's target. We'll call it 64512. Save this guy. And now we've got that. So now back over on our fabric site. What we'll notice here is there's not much else we can do at this point. We can't do anything with our wireless SID. It's not going to show up until we add a device. We can't really do anything with any of the other settings for the fabric until we get devices added. So that kind of takes care of the initial build of all of our SDA. And in the next video here, we'll configure the switches, get them added to DNAC, deploy the SDA, and finish up with some additional configurations, and then go into testing. I've got a wireless access point here. Obviously, we'll have to configure the controller. We'll have to configure ISE to allow it into the proper VLAN. I've got an IP phone. I guess we could set that up to make sure that it gets an IP address, although I don't have any like phone server or anything to connect to it. But we'll configure all of that, make sure that they get on the network. And then I do have a device that's out of band from this that I can jump on, and we'll be able to actually connect to this corporate SID and authenticate and verify that, hey, I get an IP address from my DHCP server, and at that point, I should be able to ping the internet, right? I'll go through the fabric, I'll exit the fabric through the fusion, and on up through the network. So we'll jump on in on that on the next video.